Welcome to the third dimension. On his first foreign policy address, America's place in the world, President Biden promised to end the war in Yemen and make sure America does not check its values at the door to sell arms or buy oil. Biden's decision to prioritize Yemen by appointing a special envoy, Tim Lindnerking, raised hopes that a greater emphasis on diplomacy from the United States might finally move the devastating war in Yemen towards a resolution. Yet, almost 3 years later, fulfilling this promise has proven to be uneasy. To discuss the Biden's administration role in ending Yemen's conflict, join me to talk about it, Tim Lindnerking, the U.S. Special Envoy to Yemen. Welcome to the third dimension, Mr. Lindnerking.
With you. Thank you very much.
Okay. If I may start by this now, 3 years have passed since President Biden made pronouncements regarding Yemen, yet Yemenis nationwide continue to bear the brunt of the war. The question is, how has United States diplomacy contributed to end Yemeni suffering?
I think it's a great question. And in fact, it's less than 2.5 years since that pronouncement. And I think the progress that we in the international community, and indeed, I have to say the conflict parties have made, is quite significant. When President Biden came into office just over 2 years ago, the war was raging in Yemen. There were cross-border attacks taking place at the pace in 2021 of more than 400 attacks from Yemen. There were airstrikes from the Saudi-led coalition into Yemen. There was very high loss of life, destruction of infrastructure. A lot of that has stopped. And I think that is a huge development. That's not to say, though, that the war is over. But there has been, in fact, a truce in place, if not officially, unofficially, for more than a year. There have been no cross-border attacks in either direction since March of 2022. That's more than a year. And there are elements of the truce which I think are making a tangible and very positive impact on Yemenis. Sana'a Airport opened for the first time for commercial flights since 2016. Oil and other commodities moving into Hodeidah port at an unprecedented level since the conflict started. The ability of Yemenis to move about their country, to have access to these flights, which gives them medical care in Jordan and other countries, the ability to meet with their families. Let the Yemenis themselves pronounce on this. It's not up to me or the United States to say that these are profound changes, but I think if you ask them, they will say that these are very important changes. We would also agree, though, that more needs to be done, and that is to get to a UN-led process that brings a durable ceasefire and that gets to really the crux of the matter, the crucial matter, Yemeni talks about the future of their country. And we are determined in this administration to support every effort to get to that point.
Yes. Talking about all these achievements, Mr. Lindnerking, and I agree with you on most of them, And adding to this, in one of your previous briefings, you said, we are in it to the end. It is not just to have another ceasefire and a short over process. So in this context, Mr. Lindnerking, would you elaborate on this? If not another ceasefire, if not another extended truce, what is there waiting for Yemenis?
Let me repeat exactly what you quoted of me. We are in it to the end. And by that, I mean exactly that, which is to say that we don't accept simply a truce as positive as it has been for those reasons that I've noticed, the decrease in cross-border attacks, the decrease in fighting, the ability of Yemenis to move around their country and to access medical care and visit families abroad. I think these are significant things, but we're not done. And I don't think Yemenis would regard that the situation is acceptable yet. There's still way too much food insecurity in the country. There is damaged infrastructure. There are humanitarian considerations that are still very acute. And at the end of the day, there is not an agreement to end the war yet. The parties have not sat down together and agreed on those terms and what that looks like. There's a lot of diplomatic activity to get there. There is on our part, there is between the Saudis and the Houthis and their meetings in Sana'a.
Yes.
But essential challenges have not yet been met. The issue of giving Yemeni civil servants a paycheck so that for all the work that they have done and are doing to support institutions in Yemen, which are still functioning,
Yes.
Hospitals and schools,
Yes.
they need to be paid. And that's a key issue. We need to see that the salaries get paid, and we can drive from there into the durable ceasefire and the Yemeni political talks
Yes.
that you and I have just spoken about.
Okay. So you mentioned Saudi Houthi talks and direct talks. What were backside talks? Now they have turned to be direct talks, Mr. Lindnerking. And of course, member of the United Nations Security Council welcomed that step. Okay. If I may ask, what is the position of the United States on these talks?
President Biden went to Saudi Arabia last year. Secretary of State Tony Blinken is in Saudi Arabia as we speak,
Yes.
meeting with the Saudi leadership and the Yemeni leadership to push forward, a very positive agenda on resolving this conflict. But our position simply is that the elements of the truce, while well and good, need to be solidified. And the fact, I think, when President Biden went to Saudi Arabia last year, that he was able to speak to the Crown Prince and the Saudi leadership about the importance of direct engagement with the Houthis. That has taken place. And that has moved the gaps, I think, closer between those two sides.
Yeah.
But we also would say, as the United States, the Saudi and Houthi conversations that have taken place, very important back channel talks, they themselves cannot resolve the conflict. They can make progress and address essential stumbling blocks.
Yeah.
And there needs to be compromise on both sides. We need to see that. But ultimately, those talks need to transition to a UN-led process that will drive the durable ceasefire and the Yemeni talks that will ultimately underpin the resolution of the conflict.
Yeah. On the same context, Mr. Lindnerking, so there are fears among anti-Houthi factions that such talks can undermine their role, and here I talk about the PLC and the Yemeni government. How do you react?
Well, that is definitely not the intention, and that is not an acceptable outcome, in fact, of these talks. We see that these, and maybe the Saudis or the other side don't refer them to them as talks, but let us, for the sake of ease, use that word. These back channel conversations are meant to close the gaps between these two sides. Now, ultimately, Yemenis themselves have to make the key decisions about, very important issues, governance inside Yemen, the important issues that have been raised about the role of the South and the place of the South in Yemen. These are the distribution of resources. I mean, Yemen has some very important resources and capabilities to produce oil and natural gas that are not being utilized. And these are the backbone of Yemen's economy. These need to be able to produce resources again for Yemen's economy. So we want to see the pivot, if you will, to the Yemeni political talks as soon as possible to get at these core issues. Outsiders cannot determine these issues. This is for the Yemenis themselves to decide.
Okay. On May the 17th, you received Mr. Gromberg and his team in Washington, D.C. Okay. Now, how would you describe the coordination between the United States and the United Nations in pushing peace efforts in the country?
Well, I'm glad you raised that visit because Hans Grunberg, the UN envoy, did indeed visit Washington. He met with senior American leaders, the the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor. And, there's unqualified support for the UN efforts and for his efforts in particular. We are in full support of the work that he is doing to try and bring the sides together, whether it's the Yemeni political talks, the prisoner releases that we saw in April, 900 prisoners released. There are more that need to be released. Important talks on the salary payment issues and other stumbling blocks, if you will, that have prevented the Saudis and Houthis from reaching an agreement. We want to support the UN in driving these forward. Indeed, we want to support Saudi Arabia and the Houthis in driving these conversations forward so that the Yemeni political talks can actually resume. So we are in full coordination with the UN almost on a daily basis to help support his efforts.
Okay. Now, if we move to Iran, and on your last digital briefing on the 11th of the last month, okay, you said Saudi Arabia and Iran rapprochement hasn't stopped Tehran from sending weapons to the Houthis. How would you assess Iran's role in fueling the Yemeni conflict?
I think over the past years, Iran has fueled the conflict in violation of UN Security Council resolutions endorsed by the international community to prevent the smuggling of weapons from Iran by whatever means into Yemen. And we're very hopeful that the agreement that the Saudis and the Iranians have reached would put an end to that type of smuggling. And I think it's early yet to say that box has been checked. That is an activity that Iran engaged in for many years. But we do hope that Iran will fulfill its commitment to Saudi Arabia to end the smuggling and also to support in very direct ways the political process. That is to lend its support, in fact, to the statements that Iran has made welcoming the truce and welcoming a political process. Is it actively working to support that? These are the two areas that we'd like to see Iran address, and that I think would be welcomed by the United States and indeed by the world community.
Okay, so if we now turn to the issue of the hour, that is Safar oil tanker, Mr. Lindrking, and of course the international community has made significant progress in this file, of course, with the support of the United States. If I may ask you, Mr. Lindrking, okay, have you thought of reaching what we call local teams, maintenance local teams, or civil society, including civil society supervisors, to be included in this salvation process, or it is just up to the warring parties?
I mean, I think it's a valid question. I think the challenge up to this point has been twofold. One, to get an agreement. As you know, the Houthis blocked any sort of progress on the Safar for a number of years, but a year and a half ago signed an agreement with the United Nations to allow this process to go forward. And the international community is delivering on this. I mean, the Safar has been out there as a ticking time bomb, ready to crack up and spill oil into the Red Sea, damaging fishing, livelihoods, exacerbating the humanitarian situation in Yemen. So the fact that there is now a team of technical experts on board the Safar, assessing the state of the oil and preparing for the offloading operation. I mean, this is tangible progress, and it's been driven, while it's been UN-led, it's been driven by a lot of support from many different areas, not only countries such as ourselves, which have donated or pledged $10 million for this effort, but Saudi Arabia, the Netherlands, the UK, the private sector has come forward. Environmental groups have been supportive. So this effort is finally coming to conclusion. We hope it will be a safe and very secure one in the coming weeks. that oil can be offloaded. There is still a gap of $28 million that the UN is seeking to fund, and we are supporting the UN in its efforts to raise that money so that the effort can be completed, which not only includes the transfer of the oil, but the towing and safe scrapping of the Safar tanker.
Okay. With that remark about Safar tanker, Mr. Lindnerking, we come to the end of this interview. Thank you so much for talking to Yemenis through the platforms of Yemen Today TV.
I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That's all for this time. See you next week with a new edition of The Third Dimension.